Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now if you had told me when I was a child watching the Star Wars movies that someday I would own the helmets and busts of some of my favorite characters, I would have told you were crazy. But in this video I'm going to prove kid version of me wrong with a marathon of 6 of my favorite Star Wars helmet projects. So let's get into it. Now if you're anything like me, you've been enjoying the Book of Boba Fett series and the return of the original trilogy favorites, the Tusken Raiders. So when Surebonder reached out and asked if they could send me their cosplay sticks to use in a project, I knew exactly what to make. So let's get to it. As with most helmet type builds these days, a good model is required for the base, and this build is no different. And once again I found some great files made by Brian J. Anderson, who's also known as Stormtrooper Guy on Thingiverse. And after a bit of scaling in my 3D slicer program, I got to the printing of the helmet portion of this build. While I wait for that to finish, I grabbed some duck canvas from my local fabric store and tore it into 2-inch widths and laid them out for weathering. Now this may be a bit unconventional, but I'm a fan of using instant espresso for weathering fabric. To help the espresso penetrate the canvas, I'll start by wetting down the strips with a bit of water before mixing up some of the espresso powder and applying it as randomly as possible. By changing the ratio of powder to water allows me to create a variety of stains and weathering. Plus, by using a spray bottle, I'm taking some of the human element out of it to get a much more random application. I'll repeat this process until I'm happy with how the canvas looks, and then I'll let it sit out in the sun to dry. The next step in the build will be to tackle all of the metal greeblies. These were all printed in resin and stuck to some bits of MDF with double-sided carpet tape for painting, starting with a base of medium gray satin spray paint, and then followed by a top coat of All-Clad 2 chrome to help me get a bright metal finish. The satin spray paint helps to dull the chrome top coat so that it's not quite the mirror finish you'd get with a high gloss. And the color of the spray paint also helps to make it look more like a milled aluminum rather than a polished chrome. Once I had all of my metal parts painted, it was time to set them aside and get down to some leather work on the helmet portion of the build. Based on all the reference photos, it appears that the eyes and snout are covered in leather, or in this case, a leather-like vinyl. So I grabbed some painter's tape and a marker to create a makeshift pattern that I can transfer to my vinyl. Then I cut the vinyl slightly oversized and left a tab across the nose to help smooth out the transition between the surfaces, although I found in the end that this really wasn't all that necessary. But now we can get to the fun part: assembly. The bulk of the assembly will be done using the new cosplay stick hot glue from Surebonder. They were nice enough to send me a bunch to try, and I thought this project would be a perfect opportunity to put them through their paces. So with my cosplay sticks in hand, it was time to glue the leather to the mask. Once I had the first piece attached, I was able to determine where to cut the eye openings and then glued them to the interior of the mask. With the eyes cut out, it was time to move on to adding some of the other greeblies, starting with the spikes. In hindsight, I would have done some of the other steps first, since adding all of these parts made it a bit more challenging to maneuver the helmet. So if you're planning on tackling this build for yourself, hold off until after you've done all the leather work to add on any of the metal parts. I'm using the cosplay sticks to hold everything in place, but will eventually give all of the greeblies a stronger mechanical connection with screws. So I pre-drilled holes in the helmet before starting to help guide me during the installation. You'll see here that I'm piercing the leather to make it easier to tell where the center is for the tusk parts before attaching them with the hot glue gun. Now comes the most challenging part of this build, the leather work around the mouth. To really get this to look good, you want to try to create as much bunching as possible. However, the material you use can make this a more challenging proposition. In my case, I found that this synthetic leather was a bit bulkier than I would have liked. So be sure to test your material before you start to get a better understanding of where the problems may be. Now, I won't make you watch me struggle through this, so let's jump ahead to the end. Well, it's not quite what I was hoping for, but as Adam Savage likes to say, it's serviceable, so let's continue. Next up is the snout greebly, which I glued directly onto the vinyl, and then it was time for the real leather strapping. This should hold everything in place and give it that iconic Tuscan look. With the leather straps in place and firmly glued to one another, it was time to add on the eye stalks, and then I can get to the longest and most satisfying part of this build, applying the canvas strips. To get started, I took some canvas squares and cut slits in them to place over each of the spikes. This will help make them look like they're piercing through the canvas without having to cover the entire helmet. Then it was time to start laying down the strips. There was no real plan with these since I wasn't attempting a screen-accurate replica. It was just about making it aesthetically pleasing to look at. Now I won't make you watch all of it, just know that it was a lot of gluing and massaging the pieces in place, and repeating until the entire helmet was covered in bandages. There we go. Now it's looking like something. The last thing I want to do is to add a bit of additional weathering to the entire piece. To do this, I'll be using an umber wash and my airbrush. This will give me an opportunity to add a bit of character to the metal parts, to darken any overlapping areas of the leather strap and any spots that look like they could use a bit of color. Now this wash goes on pretty light, so it's a good way to create some variation without it getting away from me like a more pigmented paint could potentially do. Showing restraint is key in this part. A little goes a long way if you ask me. I'd say it's not too bad for a one-day build. I recently reached out to fellow maker and self-proclaimed geek Brian Thompson over at the Smuggler's Room about working on a project together.
We're fans of each other's work, and we thought this would be the perfect opportunity to build something out of nothing.
You mean make something?
Out of nothing.
I thought we talked about this. We started discussing what we could collaborate on, and in the process, I found out that Brian was working on a Cantina beer tap for the Smuggler's Room.
And Derek's been looking for a lighted display for an IG-88 droid head that he's building.
So we decided that I would make the droid heads for each of us in 2 different styles.
And I would handle the lighted display stand and the beer tap design.
I better get started.
Building something out of nothing.
Damn it, Brian. You said you wouldn't do your catchphrase. Since we all know that buying droids from Jawas is bad news, I found an awesome 3D model online and got down to printing, sanding, and priming until the surface was ready for paint. Since Brian was looking for a really rusty, weathered version like you'd see around parts of Galaxy's Edge, I went with some of my favorite tricks, starting with Super 77 spray adhesive. This is an easy way to create a good amount of texture that isn't too chunky. Plus, the adhesive allows you a way to apply additional layers of weathering like sawdust, or in this case, powdered wood putty. You can apply this any way you'd like, and as much as you'd like, building up layer after layer of spray adhesive and wood putty until you're happy with the appearance. Then set it aside to dry. Once everything's dry to the touch, it's time to lay down a base coat of gloss black spray paint. The gloss black helps give our chrome paint layer a better reflectivity, although for this version it's not as important since I'll be weathering it to look like it's been left out in the deserts of Tatooine. With our glossy black layer dry, I'm going to switch over to my airbrush and some All-Clad 2 chrome lacquer paint. The metal flakes in this paint are suspended in lacquers, so be sure to really shake it before use. Keep your airbrush moving, and use a Lazy Susan to help rotate your piece until you've got good coverage. If you're shooting for a really weathered droid like I am, it's alright to have some blotchy areas. It'll help make the piece look more aged. Lacquers dry pretty fast, so after just a few minutes I'm able to start with the weathering. To really get this looking right, it's going to be important to layer the paints. So often we have a tendency to go heavy right off the bat, but to really get a realistic look it's important to add layer upon layer of paint until you've built up to the final look. I started with pure black that's been thinned out with some glass cleaner. You could also do this with water, but I found that glass cleaner thins the acrylics more evenly without clumps. I'm applying the paint to all the recesses and then wiping the paint away with a damp rag. If your paint is too heavy, you can spray the surface of your droid with the glass cleaner to help wipe away the excess. Once I've got all the hard-to-reach areas taken care of, I'm going to switch to dabbing paint along the surface and then spraying it down to get the paint to run more naturally, blotting up any paint that's too heavy or looks unnatural. This step is totally up to you and the degree of age you're looking for. Just keep in mind that we'll be adding other colors. Now that I've got my darkest paint layer down, I'm going to switch to a medium brown paint and I'm going to apply it using the same technique, dabbing paint across the surface and blotting up any excess, then repeating until I'm happy with how it looks. The final bit of weathering will be some rust. Since there's already a ton of texture, I don't need to use any of the rust techniques from my other videos. So I'll mix up some orange and yellow acrylic paint to a bright rust color, and we'll dab it into the areas where rust might accumulate, wiping away any of the excess. This is definitely a case of less is more. If there's any areas that don't look quite right, go back and add in more layers of weathering until it looks right to you, and then set it aside to dry. Now that I have Brian's beer tap droid squared away, it's time for me to start on my recently deactivated droid head. I'm going to start again with the spray adhesive since it's a nice soft texture that gives a real used universe look without being too grunged up. Then it's on to gloss black spray paint. For this version, since I want more of the chrome shine, I'm applying a light dust pass of paint and then a much heavier wet pass, being sure not to go too heavy and cause drips. Once it's dry, we're going on to applying the chrome paint. You'll notice that it's much shinier than the first version. That extra time spent on the wet coat of spray paint really makes all the difference. Now we can move on to weathering, which will be much less severe for this version. To start, I'm going to thin down a medium brown acrylic paint with glass cleaner, and with the airbrush at about 15 psi, I'm going to apply paint along any horizontal lines in the model to create a slightly greasy look. I've got a wet rag handy to break up any areas of paint that look too heavy, and we'll go around the entire piece, hitting any areas that look like they could have some buildup. When I'm happy with the look, I'll set aside the airbrush and we'll switch to a can of matte black spray paint, which I'll use to dust over the entire surface. This will help to dull down some of the chrome paint while giving it a mottled look. You want to be at least 18 to 24 inches away from your piece and be sure to apply from different angles. The The last thing to do is add a touch of rust with some burnt sienna paint. This should be really subtle. You'll definitely remove more paint than you leave on. So as many of you know, the fires around LA last month have left a lot of people in need of help. But thankfully, the Star Wars maker community is answering the call through a charity auction called LA Strikes Back. So in this video, I'll be tackling my contribution to the auction by painting a custom first responder inspired helmet. So let's get into it. Like most projects, this one starts with a base. This X-Wing helmet was donated to me by fellow maker and co-host of the Dad Batch podcast, Rami Shanaday. I removed the visor to make it easier to paint, and can jump right into applying a coat of automotive primer to the parts of this vacuum-formed helmet. While I waited for the primer to dry, I thought it would be helpful to put together an inspiration board to help guide my decision-making. Since these helmets are to be themed after first responders, I thought it could be cool for the helmet to mimic the gear worn by firefighters. I also thought of converting some of the elements of the firefighter helmets to the Star Wars aesthetic and vice versa, to apply more specifically to the cause. With those decisions locked in and my primer dry, I started to apply a layer of Sahara Beige, since it's the color of the Shore Trooper armor in Rogue One, but is also a decent match to the khaki color of the firefighter uniforms. Now that my base layer of paint is down, I shifted my attention to this mohawk tip. I thought it might look cool if it looked as if it was caked in ash, so I grabbed some acrylic modeling paste and an acid brush and randomly applied the paste to build up texture. Having this piece already painted in black primer made it easy to see where I had applied the modeling paste, but also gave me a sense of what it would look like when it was dry. I worked the paste until it had the look I was after, and then I set it aside to dry and spent some time off camera masking off the helmet. I thought these side panels would be the best spot to bring in a bit more color to the helmet, and I could use the dark gray of the reinforced knees from the fire gear, just to continue to tie in the color scheme of their suits. But before I apply color, I'll use some satin clear to help seal the edges of the masking tape to give me the best chance at super crisp lines. When the clear was dry, I grabbed the dark gray and hit the side panels with a dust coat and then a heavier top coat just to make sure there's no drips in my finish. All of this work will eventually get aged, but I still want to start with the best possible base layer so that I don't have to do extra work to hide my mistakes. A bit later and after the paint had dried, I removed my masking to see how I did. There were a few small spots where my tape didn't quite hug the curves in a continuous line, but that's totally workable, especially when I'll be aging it. Whenever I'm doing multiple coats of paint and weathering, I like to apply clear coat throughout the process, especially before weathering, just to make sure that all of my paint layers are protected. It's probably overkill, but I'd rather err on the side of caution. I've also found that oil paints move a bit more easily on cleared surfaces, so whether I use them or not, it's just a habit of mine. Once the clear coat had dried, I could get to applying this fluorescent reflective tape to the mohawk. It's designed to be heat set, but I'm going to use a bit of spray adhesive first to make sure that it's where I want it. When I'm happy with its position, I'll go back and remove the protective layer, and then off camera I'll hit it with a hot hairdryer to really lock it in place. I also glued on the mohawk tip with some 5-minute epoxy. There was a bit of a rain delay, so instead of waiting, I headed into my computer and decided to get started on creating some graphics for the helmet. I wanted to add the victory decals to the sides of the helmet, but also have them reference all of the fires that were happening near us. The Palisades, Eaton, Kenneth, and Hughes fires. So I started by creating the circle and adding this fire icon that I sourced online. Then I found a font that looked close enough to the original victory symbol and merged it with the flame icon to create the final decal. This got exported into my vinyl cutter software and was cut from a burnt orange and black permanent vinyl, but I'll need to merge the two before applying them. To do this, I used some transfer tape to pull the black decal off of its backing paper and then placing it onto the orange circles. Then I could use the same transfer tape to pull both pieces off of the backing paper and can get to applying them to the helmet. As with most decal applications, I like to mist the surface with a mix of water and a drop of dish soap to allow me some time to move the decal into its final position before pushing out the water and permanently affixing it to the helmet. This ratio varies based on how much water is used, but know that it takes very little soap for this trick to work. I started with the two outside decals to help better space the interior ones, and once they were in position, I could remove the transfer tape, wipe away any excess water, and my decals are set. This got repeated on the opposite side of the helmet, along with some additional decals to make the helmet more interesting. The key to most decal applications is to take your time and start from either an edge or the middle and work out any air bubbles until your graphic is laying flat against the surface. It takes some patience, especially on curved surfaces like this one, but your patience will be rewarded. At this point, I had an idea that wasn't part of my original plan. I was able to 3D print the LA Strikes Back logo as an embellishment, but I wanted it to be gold. So I started with some matte black, and once it was dry, I used a bit of antique gold rub and buff to give it the look of an old coin. I figured the logo should be somewhere on the helmet as a reminder of why it was made, and that seemed like a subtle way to accomplish it. When I was happy with the finish, I used a bit of CA glue to stick it in place, and then I could get back to the decal work. These crown decals were really challenging for me to apply to the helmet because of all the curves, so rather than stretching them out of shape, I just cut them wherever they'd ripple. But now that means I need to lean into this imperfection, so I grabbed a razor blade and started picking at them to make them look a bit more organic. This would have been much easier as a painted stencil rather than a decal, but it didn't occur to me that the curve of the helmet would make them so hard to apply. That said, I think this is a good solve and in the end should look the part of a damaged helmet. Now that I've got all the decals squared away, I can get to dirtying this thing up. I started by thinning down a dark gray model paint with a bit of isopropyl alcohol and randomly applying it all over the helmet. I'm trying not to think about it too much, since I don't want to create any repeating patterns in the application. When I think I've got good coverage, I switch to a nylon brush with some 75% isopropyl alcohol and start to reactivate the paint to push it around, followed by a bit of blotting with a rag. While I'm doing this, I'm thinking about the dirt and ash and water that would cover a first responder's helmet, and I'm doing my best to replicate what that looks like in my head, while also trying to be inconsistent and random. It's harder than you'd think, since humans seek patterns, but I really had to move around and try not to spend too much time in any one spot to keep from overworking the paint. To break it up even more, I'd flick the isopropyl alcohol onto the helmet just to create spots and runs and give the helmet more organic character. This is pretty subtle, but I think it helped to pull it all together. When I felt like the weathering was in a good place, I grabbed a bamboo skewer and started to create some chips and scratches. This helps to sell the damage to the grid decal and just generally give the helmet more of a story, since you'd likely never see a helmet this dirty without at least a few scratches. There were also a few areas where the chipping looked a bit too handmade, but thankfully I was able to hit those with a bit more alcohol to soften them up and make them look a bit more organic. The last thing to do with this helmet is to add a final dusting of a lighter ash color to the surface. So I loaded up my airbrush with light gray paint thinned with isopropyl alcohol and randomly applied it to the entire helmet. Then I could follow it up with a bit of silver Sharpie to give some of the scratches a bit more depth, and then I could call this one finished. Hey gang, it's me again. This week's video doesn't have a sponsor, so I wanted to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters who really make these videos possible. If you've ever found these videos to be helpful or inspiring over the years, please consider becoming a patron so that I can continue to bring you a new video every week. Thanks. So this week I'm dipping into the archives again to revisit a project that's over 10 years in the making, and whose most recent update was about 4 years ago. Now if you guessed Princess Leia's bounty hunter helmet from Return of the Jedi, you'd be right. So rather than wait a second longer, let's get into it. The paint job on this helmet from 4 years ago isn't bad, but I've spent the last 4 years learning and improving my skills, and I think I can do better. So I start with a bit of the reddish brown that makes up the base color to give the entire helmet, aside from the silver visor opening, a bit of a refresh. I'm not going for a completely new base layer. I just want to break up the surface a bit to give it a more modeled appearance. When I'm happy with the coverage, I mix up a bit of light gray and isopropyl alcohol to create a thin wash, and then repeat the previous step. I'm trying to bring sort of a dusty look to the helmet, but I also want to be able to still see that patchy paint variation too. Having more reference photos really helped make this process a lot easier, but it also made me realize that accurate and idealized aren't always the same. So I'm doing my best to walk the line between the two, leaning more heavily on what this helmet looks like when I think about it, rather than trying to make it match a bunch of photos taken with multiple cameras and lenses and under a variety of lighting scenarios, since those three things can cause the appearance to look wildly different from image to image. Once it was starting to come more in line with my idea of the helmet, I grabbed some pewter rub and buff and gave the side greeblies a touch-up, since the brown and gray paints had dulled them down a bit. It doesn't take much for this rub and buff to bring out the details in these parts, so you'll really want to sneak up on it should you ever need to use this for a project of your own. Another detail that was dulled in the paint application was all of the metal chipping effects. When I painted this 4 years ago, I did all of these with aluminum metallic paint and a brush. But this time around, I'm going with my tried and true silver marker approach. Ideally, I'd be using an ultra-fine point marker, but the point on this one is alright for this application, and if I feel like it needs a bit more definition, I can always go back and add more at a later date. At this point, I wasn't completely sold on my paint application, but thought if I could blot away some of the paint with a brush and some solvent, it might leave me with a more organic look that was closer to what I was after. It was a risky move, and I didn't film the process, but thankfully Mrs. Van Oaks is always at the ready for a dramatic reenactment. With that squared away, I could start on the leather work. Years ago, I purchased a kit that included these pre-cut pieces. Now it was just up to me to glue them in place, starting with a bit of CA glue along the upper ridge to hold down the edge. Once that was in place, I grabbed an ancient can of contact cement and applied it to the helmet and the leather, and after a few minutes could bond them together, making sure to smooth it out towards the front to remove any air pockets. To make sure that the material doesn't lift, I ran some more CA glue along the edges and then could trim off any excess. This was an absolute must around the nose since there's a piece that needs to fit into the inset, and so I made sure to trim back as much as I could, but still keeping enough of the leather to ensure a lasting bond. A quick test fit of the nose greebly, and then I could get on with the rest of the leather wrap. The method for the lower jaw is the same as the upper. It just includes tucking the material under the lip of the helmet and gluing it in place. Thankfully, this material is pliable and took to the curves of the helmet with minimal bunching. When the first round of leather work was done, I shifted my attention to the nose greebly. This piece is supposed to be chromed, so I'll start with a layer of high-gloss varnish applied with my airbrush at around 15 psi. The varnish was allowed to dry for an hour, and then it was time for the chrome paint, which was also applied at low air pressure. And when the part was dry, I grabbed my glue and got it set in position in the helmet. Now I definitely had to work for it, since the wrapping made for a tight fit, but once it was in position, there was no getting it back out. Next up is this back cover piece. I picked up a fresh can of contact cement and then applied it to a few spots on the leather, as well as some corresponding points inside the helmet. And once it was tacky, I could press it into place. And while the framing of this shot is terrible, the installation turned out pretty well, and I could move on to the strap piece that goes around the back of the helmet. Off camera, I painted and dry brushed these greeblies with more of the pewter rub and buff, and they'll get glued to this bit of strapping with contact cement.
Hey gang, it's me again. This week's video doesn't have a sponsor, so I wanted to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters who really make these videos possible. If you've ever found these videos to be helpful or inspiring over the years, please consider becoming a patron so that I can continue to bring you a new video every week. Thanks.
Once the glue had set up, I could affix the end points of the strap to the sides of the helmet with a bit more contact cement, and then I was finished with the soft goods portion of this project. Now that I'm in the home stretch on this helmet, I can get to tackling the antenna. This resin cast piece was painted black and dry brushed with rub and buff before being knocked back with a bit of isopropyl alcohol. Then I secured it in place with a small screw from inside of the helmet. The smaller metallic detail piece was painted just like the nose detail, with the black base, gloss clear, and chrome. and needs to be installed over the small metal post with a bit of CA glue. And then I'm calling this one done. For now.
Now as a maker, I'm always on the lookout for new ways to bond materials together. Everything from plastics and metals to foam. So when Beacon Adhesive reached out about having me build something Star Wars inspired for their New York City Comic-Con booth, I thought it was a good opportunity to test out some new adhesives, plus I could make something that's been on my to-do list for a long time. A protocol droid. So let's get into it.
These were 3D printed in ABS plastic, but before I do anything, these parts are going to need to be sanded, starting with 150 grit sandpaper. It looked a little something like this. Because I printed the files at a high resolution, this process doesn't take much time before the print lines start to disappear. And once I felt like the surface was smooth enough, it was time to shift locations and get to priming. I'm using a high build primer to make quick time of the process, starting with a dust coat, followed by a pause to allow the primer to flash off its solvents, and then applying a heavier coat. This dust coat helps to give the next pass of primer or paint something to hang on to, which should help to prevent drips in your finish. I'll keep rotating these pieces to make sure I haven't missed anything, and then I can set them aside to dry for 1 hour. While I wait, I can get started on the display stand. And for that I'll be using a 2-inch tall slice from a 6-inch PVC pipe and a detail piece that I designed in Illustrator and cut from MDF on my laser cutter. The detail piece will rest on the pipe edge to form a cap, so I grab the quick grip contact adhesive and get to gluing. This goes on like a thick CA glue but with the working time like a fast set epoxy, which is good because the pipe isn't exactly round and I'll need a little working time to figure out the best alignment. Once the position was right, the quick grip locked it in place, and through the magic of video, I have my base primed and ready for me to lay down a coat of silver spray paint as my base color. This will mostly be hidden by the top color, but I want some areas to show through, so I'll coat the entire piece just to be safe. After a few minutes of drying out in the sun, I could grab my tiny spray bottle of water and some salt, and we'll use them to create an aged paint effect. I'll start by misting the base to give the salt something to stick to, and then randomly sprinkle salt across the top before applying my top coat of white spray paint. This will give me a really organic, worn look that should be perfect for this piece. Once the paint had dried, I could go in with a small brush and flick away any of the salt to expose the silver color below. Then it could go back out into the sun to fully cure, and I could switch back to K3PO's head. At this point, my primer was fully dry and so it was time to wet sand all of the pieces of this build. I'll be using the small spray bottle of water to help keep the surface damp, but not oversaturated, and for this pass, I'll be using 500 grit wet sand sandpaper. When I'm wet sanding, I try to work in quadrants, only wetting down the areas I'll be actively sanding, and will be on the lookout for visual changes in the surface of the print, since water will bead up on areas that haven't yet been sanded, and areas that have may have primer buildup that I'll want to either wash away with a bit of water or wipe off with a towel to make sure my surface is as smooth as possible. This is the part of the build where the time you put into it really shows up in the finished product, so you'll want to be patient with the process. Because of my prep work up front, this step only took about 20 minutes for the front and back of K3PO's head, but I won't make you watch all of that. I just wanted to give you a better idea of the time spent in case you wanted to tackle something similar. When I was confident that the parts were smooth, I rinsed them off and let them dry, and then could get to doing a bit of assembly, starting with the eyes. These will get inserted from the front, and then I'll apply a bit of contact adhesive to the inside of the mask. That way I don't have to worry about excess adhesive buildup, although this quick grip can be cleaned off with a bit of acetone. It was also a good time to add in the rear detail on the back of the head, as well as the small antenna at the top, and then I could join the halves together. These parts nest into one another, but I'll need to affix some bolts to these neck details that will make it so that the hardware that holds everything together is hidden. And when the adhesive is set, I can install them through the small holes in the neck, and I'll finally see K3PO's assembled head. This also means it's time for paint. K3PO's claim to fame is that he's not gold like his more famous counterpart C3PO, but instead he's white. So with some white spray paint at the ready, I could apply a dust coat of paint to the head, followed by a little dry time to allow the paint to flash off any of the solvents, and then hit it with a heavier glamour coat. It's important to always keep the can moving and to apply paint from multiple directions to ensure even coverage. And when I think I've covered everything, I'll set it aside to dry overnight. It's the following day, and it's time to protect the base paint with a satin clear coat. This will lock in the color and also creates less surface tension on the prop, which makes weathering it easier. This is not the time to go heavy with your clear coat. Light, even passes with a bit of dry time between will get you the best results and prevent unwanted surface defects. When the clear coat is dry, I'll switch over to a medium gray acrylic paint that I've thinned with water and will liberally apply a wash to the surface of the prop before wiping it away with a damp towel. I'm looking to grunge this piece up, being sure to work the wash down into the detail areas around the neck and the back of the head, but still allow for the base color to shine through. In the deeper recesses, I'll go heavy with my paint application and then use the spray bottle to break it up, allowing it to spread and run in a more organic way than I'd be able to recreate by hand. I'll repeat this step until I'm happy with how it looks, and off camera I'll apply the same steps to the base to make the two pieces look cohesive. Then I can set everything aside to dry. The last thing on my to-do list is to add in the eyes, starting with these rounds that I laser cut from a prismatic light cover. These pieces have a small insert that needs to be glued in place, but it's a bit fidgety due to its size. So I decided to try the multi-grip glue because it's got a detailed tip on the bottle that should make this glue up a lot easier. Once the inserts are glued in place, I can friction fit them into the eye sockets, as well as these LED lights to give it a more screen-accurate glow. And with that, this replica of K3PO's head is done.
So this week's project is something that's been on my someday list for when I had a 3D printer with a large enough build volume to print it all in one go. And thanks to this week's video sponsor, Bamboo Lab, today is that day. So let's get started on building this RA7 Death Star droid head.
I kicked off the project by importing the file into Bamboo Studio and moved it around until I found an orientation that would allow me to print it in one go. Which, if you know this droid, you know that's a big ask. But much to my surprise, I was able to find a position that worked, used minimal supports, and so I sent it off to the H2D to get printing. The H2D does more than just 3D printing. It can also laser cut materials like acrylic, and also has the ability to cut vinyl decals. I won't be doing either of those tasks for this project, but it's nice to know that it could should I need it. And after 1 day, 10 hours, and 55 minutes, I had my droid head. This print is really clean considering I printed it at a taller layer height. Now I just need to remove the supports and then I could get to smoothing out the print. There's a spot that needs a little extra attention because I forgot to turn on the variable layer height setting in Bamboo Studio before printing, so the layers at the top are much more pronounced than they could have been. Thankfully, I printed this in ABS filament with wall loop set to 10, so it's essentially solid plastic without any infill, and I can be as aggressive as I need to with my sanding to make the layer lines disappear. When I was done with the forehead, I could switch to the back, where there's a thin line that was likely caused by a blob of filament being stuck on the nozzle. But before I went any further, I wanted to make sure that it was just superficial. So I took my 80 grit sandpaper again and scuffed the surface, and when I could confirm that it wasn't all the way through the print, I switched to a razor blade and scraped the surface flat. Now this works much like a card scraper does in woodworking. It removes thin layers of material and leaves you with a flat, smooth finish. I continued to sand the rest of the surface until it looked like most of the layer lines were gone. Then I switched over to some 240 grit sandpaper that's foam backed to help me get into all of the contours without leaving any scratch lines from the hard edges of traditional sandpaper. At this point, I could lay down my first coat of automotive filler primer, starting with a dust coat, allowing a minute for the solvents to flash off, and then going back with a heavier coat. I repeated this step twice to ensure I had good coverage, and then I set it aside to dry. After about 30 minutes of dry time, I could get back to sanding, but this time it will be with some extra fine steel wool. The steel wool acts a lot like fine grit sandpaper, but its best feature is just how easily it works on contoured surfaces, and this piece has a bunch. After just a bit of sanding, you can see how it's basically buffing the surface of the helmet, which is great for anything that will be getting a gloss finish. I'm roughly 3 hours in on my prep work and sanding, and when it looked like I'd sufficiently sanded everything, it was time to paint. But before I start painting, I need to make sure that this droid head is free of dust or anything that would potentially ruin the finish. So I grabbed a tack cloth and gave it a wipe down. Now sadly, this didn't save me from ruining the finish, but more about that in a minute. Since this droid has a metallic finish, I'm going with a gloss black base. Now typically I do this with a matte black and then apply a high gloss clear coat over the top, but I ran out of clear and was in a bit of a time crunch, so I used a gloss black spray paint, hitting it with a dust coat first, giving it a minute or so to tack up, and then applying a heavier coat. And this is where I ruined the finish, and all those hours of sanding. I started to notice these tiny bubbles appearing in the finish, which I later learned is called solvent pop. It happens when an outer skin forms on the paint that causes the evaporating solvents to be trapped underneath. Now the day I was painting this piece, it was in the 90s, so it's no surprise that it happened. Of course, I could sand the helmet down again and try to minimize the bubbles, but the following day was going to be even hotter. So instead, I decided to move forward, having learned a very valuable lesson in the process. Plus, I was planning on weathering this thing up, so I'll just lean into the imperfections to hide my mistakes. About an hour has passed and the paint was dry but still slightly tacky, which means it's time for my metallic paint. And for this I'm going with my favorite, Alumiluster, which I'll apply using a detailed HVLP spray gun. This paint goes on at low air pressure, somewhere between 15 and 20 psi, and is applied in multiple passes until a consistent finish is achieved, and then can be buffed to a shine. Now with all the issues in the base layer, I'm not too concerned about the buffing, especially after noticing some slumping in the gloss finish that I didn't see until the metallic paint went over it. But again, I'm thinking about this droid riding the dunes of Tatooine in the hull of a sandcrawler, so it's not going to be perfect, and it doesn't need to be. And speaking of Tatooine, I'll be using a familiar method to get that dusty, grimy look on this helmet, starting by applying this dark umber paint into all of the recesses and broadly across the entire piece with my airbrush. This color has quickly become my go-to for so many weathering projects since the color is a good balance between rust and grease. Plus, it dries a lot faster than oil paints. When the umber paint is dry, I'll apply a light coat of hairspray to the entire helmet, and once it's dry, I'll dust the surface with a sky gray acrylic paint to help dull the shine of the metallic as well as the umber paint. This helps to soften the contrast of the two colors, but when it's dry, it can be reactivated with a bit of water and a brush or a rag, and that's how I'll hide all those mistakes from earlier. This method is something I learned from scale model builders and has become a favorite weathering technique for projects like this one, since it doesn't use any harsh solvents to remove layers of paint that could potentially ruin the metallic finish. I'll keep making my way around the droid head, spraying with water, scrubbing lightly with a paintbrush, and blotting away with a damp rag until I'm happy with the results. For any areas that need more finesse, I'll grab a cotton swab, dampen it with water, and use it to add some more localized highlights around the helmet. This is also a good way to fix any areas that may not look quite how I'd like. And when I'd made my way around the entire helmet, it was time to call this done. Or at least this part. I want to add vacuum-formed lenses so this can be worn at some point, plus I still need to print the lower neckline. But I ran out of filament, so that's a project for another day.
Now, while this build had a few challenges, most of them because I didn't know what paints I had on hand, I still think it turned out great and will be an excellent addition to my collection. And if for nothing else, it reminded me that it's okay to lean into the imperfections. I'd like to thank Bambu Lab for sending me their new H2D printer. It's a great addition to my shop that's going to be getting a lot of use, and if you want to know more about it, I'll leave a link to it in the video description. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.
Mm-hmm.